Thank you all for joining. As the slide says, this evening's session is being recorded, and the video will be up on our historic Chevy Chase DC website in a day or so. This is a Zoom webinar, and we've got over 100 people registered. So we're going to collect questions and comments during the session using the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen or the chat box. HCC DC President Carl Lankowski is going to open our meeting.
Well, welcome everyone. We're here tonight to eavesdrop on a conversation between two cognoscenti of Black culture in the nation's capital. Their subject is the connections between Chevy Chase DC and Georgetown in life and in death, from the formation of the first African-American congregations in the antebellum period through the ensuing century. Historic Chevy Chase DC is honored to offer a platform for this event because we believe that the more a community knows about where it has been, the better its chances of shaping a desirable future, outward-looking, inclusive, and diverse. Through our programming over the past decade, we have sought to deepen our perspectives on the place we inhabit. Tonight's conversation is a welcome addition. Now, in framing this event, it is a sad duty to note the recent passing of a colleague, a friend, and a passionate voice for racial justice among us, James Fisher. James is an eighth-generation direct descendant of Captain George Pointer, whose offspring lived and thrived in Chevy Chase, DC. James was the face and a lot of the motive force behind this community's efforts to come to terms with its past. His spirit is present, and we dedicate this event to his memory. Our discussants this evening are Lisa Fager and Mark Auslander. Lisa Fager is the executive director of Black Georgetown Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to reclaiming the past and preserving the future of the historic Mount Zion and Female Union Band Society cemeteries in Georgetown, active from 1808 to 1950 and historically African American. She leads the efforts to protect and restore this American treasure and to resurrect the wealth of stories and historical artifacts that reflect the rich legacy of Black Georgetown. Her work at Mount Zion Female Union Band Society has been featured in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and many other publications and media outlets. With Mark Auslander, she is the co-author of Nanny Stone, Commemoration and Resistance, in the journal Southern Spaces from last July. Mark Auslander is a sociocultural anthropologist who currently teaches anthropology at Mount Holyoke College in Western Massachusetts. He has worked extensively as a scholar and museum professional on experiences of racial oppression and restorative justice initiatives in Southern Africa and the United States. His award-winning book, The Accidental Slave Owner, Revisiting a Myth of Race and Finding an American Family, was published in 2011. Now, Mark grew up as a neighbor on Chevy Chase Parkway and attended Lafayette Elementary School. But although he has long worked on histories of enslavement, liberation, and race in DC, he tells us, he only recently realized that he came of age on the lands that had once been inhabited by persons enslaved by the Belt family from the 18th century until the Civil War era. In dialogue with descendant families and historic Chevy Chase DC members, he has been reconstructing histories of slavery and freedom making in Chevy Chase DC. Okay, we have but a short hour this evening. If you would like to pose a question to Mark or Lisa, please use the Q&A function. Time will be reserved following their presentations to address as many as possible. Lisa and Mark, over to you.
Thank you. And I want to say thank you for having us. And everybody, thank you for joining us tonight. I see We have quite a few people I know online, so thank you for coming. The title of our presentation is Historic Black Chevy Chase, DC, the Mount Zion and Female Union Band Society Cemetery, Tracing Connections. I'm Lisa Fager from the Black Georgetown Foundation. For those who don't know what that is, it's a nonprofit 501c3 that manages the preservation and restoration for the Mount Zion and Female Union Band Society cemeteries located in Georgetown. And of course, Dr. Mark Auslander will be following me. I'm going to give you just a quick really overview of the cemeteries and not go too deep and trying to make this short now. But the two things we need to remember is it's two cemeteries. A lot of time and throughout history, people just called it Mount Zion Cemetery. And it's two cemeteries, and I'll start with the history of the first one. Originally, I guess on the right side is the Mount Zion, originally the old Methodist burying ground. It was purchased by the Montgomery Street Methodist Church in 1808 for the burial of both white and Black free and enslaved parishioners of the church. What's interesting is the church started around 1772 before the United States was established. And so by 1813, the Black parishioners were really kind of over the mistreatment and the lack of, equality, I guess, really not having the same benefits in the church as the white parishioners and having been relegated to the balcony. They wanted their own church. And so by 1816, the white Methodists agreed they could have their own church, and they moved around the corner, actually, very close to where the cemetery is, around 27th Street, 27th and Q. We're located around on 27th and Q Street off of Mill Road, literally right beside, if you're familiar with the Dumbarton Museum House, we're literally right beside them. And so then the African Americans in the church had their own church, but they continued to share the cemetery with white parishioners until so in about 1842, actually, the Female Union Band Society, which was a mutual aid organization, which was made up of free Black women. They paid in weekly, and if something happened to you, you were unemployed, you got ill, they would give you money to help, get you over. And so this was really about women taking care of each other because they weren't enslaved. Nobody was making sure they had clothes. Nobody was oh, I'm sorry. I can see your chats and I'm getting distracted. But anyway, the Mutual Aid Society made sure that rents were paid if people were ill and couldn't work. And they also were able to buy this burial ground. Now, you should know in 1842, Black nor white women were able to really purchase property. So they got a man to do it. And so they owned this property in 1842. Come 1849, Oak Hill Cemetery is established, and it is established by William Corcoran, who's a Confederate sympathizer, and it is a white-only 22-acre cemetery. The Mount Zion and Female Union Band, as you can see in the picture, they are right beside each other. There are no physical barriers. There's nothing that separates them via the eye. But all the way over to the left would be Oak Hill Cemetery. Once that happened, the white parishioners in the old Methodist ground / Mount Zion started to disinter their relatives in the cemetery and bury them in Oak Hill and other white-only cemeteries around the city. And so that's really the history of the property. The people who were buried in the property, which Mark will get into the details of that. Oh, yes, of course. The cemetery, Mount Zion Cemetery, was also known as a stop on the Underground Railroad. I wanted to show you the different pictures. The black and white picture at the top is a picture from the 70s, but that really gives you an idea of how this was used as a refuge on the Underground Railroad. It is a holding, actually I spelled that wrong, it's a burial holding vault, and people were kept inside of there when the ground was too cold or too wet to dig and put them in the ground. And so people who were freedom seekers who were going north would hide inside there. And we know that there were churches around the area, not just Mount Zion, but also participated in leaving things at the burial vault for those who were fleeing north. And so I want to stop there. Oh, no, I don't. I'm sorry, y'all. I forget that we made something. I wanted to actually show this because this is some of the articles and what people were saying about the cemetery all the way back into the 1800s. And what's fascinating to me is that there's a lot of ancestral memory. People not knowing this is Nanny's grave. Nanny's grave has been like this since the early 90s or late 90s, when a man decided he was going to fix up Nanny's grave and put toys on it. Well, that lasted up until last year, where people were putting toys on this grave for 30 years and nobody bothered it. And then someone on Juneteenth set it on fire right after we gave a tour, 250 people. I was very devastated. But the irony is this article that you see from 1894 was published in 14 newspapers around the world, not just in the United States, ironically, but not in Washington, D.C. So we never saw this article until last year when somebody was looking up something else. Clearly, it's our cemetery. They even talk about Oak Hill. And they were discussing the customs of the cemetery. And the customs were very much like what people are doing for Nanny. There were things on graves, like the whole cemetery was this way. So there was a man who was a coachman. And so when he died, his wife sold his horse, bought a wooden horse, and buried it coming out of the ground next to his grave. There was a woman who was buried with her favorite hat for church on the grave, and even a woman who was buried with a fan on her grave because she was going to need it where she was going. And so I think it's fascinating, like this window we have where we don't even know that our present is mirroring our past. And so there's such an opportunity, particularly with Black cemeteries. I feel like they are really filling a history void, putting context to things that we didn't know. I'm learning so much researching the folks in the cemetery, the history of the cemetery. I mean, there's so many things to discuss. I mean, from eugenics to repatriation to just learning the customs that African Americans use until this day. I mean, you see how people still put stones on the graves. They put seashells all through our cemetery. In the ground, you'll find seashells coming up. So it's such a rich history, and even more exciting is researching the individuals. And so with that, I'm going to pass the mic to Dr. Auslander.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. As Lisa said, the Mount Zion and Female Union Band Society Cemetery offer remarkable windows in terms of ancestral memory, but they also give us a sense of the fascinating interconnections between enslaved and free people of color all over the region. And we're going to concentrate tonight on connections historically to what's now Chevy Chase, D.C., looking both at the belt plantations that are sort of clustered around what's now Chevy Chase Circle, and Dry Meadows Farm, which many of you know as the Lafayette Elementary School George Pointer Park area. And in both cases, those families, enslaved and free, do have close connections to Mount Zion and the Female Union Band Society Cemetery, several miles away. Many of you have seen the plaque on Chevy Chase Circle to Colonel Joseph Belt, who holds the first patent for the neighborhood known as Chevy Chase. First 500 acres, then 1,000 acres. And many things are mentioned, but of course the plaque doesn't mention his extensive slave holdings, not only right here, but all over Anne Arundel County, Prince George's County, and so forth. There may have been more than one Belt Manor house, but certainly by the early 1800s, Joseph Sprigg Belt was clearly established, who was the grandson of the earlier Joseph Belt, Colonel Joseph Belt. And here's one of the last pictures we have of that manor house at the address that's now essentially 3734 Oliver Street, familiar to many of you. So we'll try to bear in mind the extent of those Belt plantations, which were slowly broken up, what would have been both on both sides of the Maryland, D.C. Border after the establishment of the district, in unincorporated Washington County. And then to the right of the screen, what's now Broad Branch Road, the location of Dry Meadows Farm, the Pointer, Harris, and a number of other, as many of you know, free families who from 1850 or so onwards had as free people farmland, which they continued, as many of you know, has been extensively researched, continued to control up until the period between maybe 1928 to 1931, when they were gradually forced off through a variety of causes that we'll discuss. So the story for me begins right here on what we believe to have been the principal burial ground on the Belt plantations. There are many headstones reported as late as the early years of the last century. And that house directly that we see at the end of this little cul-de-sac, in fact, is 5807 Chevy Chase Parkway, where I grew up from 1965 onwards with my sister and parents, with no understanding, not even thinking that there was a long history of enslavement. And I've sort of been with Lisa reflecting on a history of white privilege that really made it possible for me not even to understand the long history of race and land dispossession on the very end exploitation of that land that I grew up in. Very briefly, the Belts are a complicated family intermarried to many important slave-owning families primarily in Maryland. But Colonel Joseph Belt, who we mentioned, when he dies in 1759, immediately, just a little bit after the death of his son, Joseph Belt Jr., they were not only major farmers and obviously political and military figures. Joseph Belt Jr. almost certainly, we see from the records, was involved in the transatlantic slave trade coming into Upper Marlboro, up the Patuxent. And then his son, Joseph Sprigg Belt, inherits the area that we call Chevy Chase Manor, and he dies in 1817, leaving behind two sons who sort of split the enslaved people, and we have pretty good records on who those enslaved people were. Charles Richard Belt remained in the area that's now Oliver Street and Chevy Chase Parkway in Chevy Chase. His brother went off to sea, became a naval officer until the early 1840s, when he actually was court-martialed and thrown out of the Navy, and established a slave plantation first near Upper Marlboro in PG County, and then moves into Calvert County, where he dies in the late 1850s. We know we do have the names of the enslaved people that were held right there in the Joseph Sprigg Belt location. That is to say, what's now roughly Oliver Street and Chevy Chase Parkway. You can see their names here. And some of those names reappear in subsequent slave sales. They're distributed as the estate is liquidated, but some remain among, as far as we can tell. Hannah seems to have children, some of whom remain, such as Letha, remain for the rest of her life, or almost for the rest of her life, in Chevy Chase. Other of those children are transferred out to Prince George's County and Calvert County, and we're working with descendants on both sides. So we do, those two brothers, if we go back to them for a moment, Charles Richard Belt and Lieutenant William Joseph Belt, their estates fall out after William Joseph Belt dies. His widow, Ellen Ursula Bowie Belt, sues her brother-in-law, trying to recover land in a good deal of enslaved people. And thanks to that, we do have pretty good plats of the land that they're fighting over and some information about the enslaved people they're battling over. Remember, 1859, just on the eve of the Civil War, but slavery is still a major concern and the principal source of the White Belt family. So we see this interesting map. This is in the National Archives in the Chancery case of Belt versus Belt. Gives us evidence of what the Belt household looked like. We're guessing, and this is really just speculative, we know from the 1860 slave schedule, as you can see, there's only one slave dwelling. All the enslaved people seem to have lived together according to the 1860 slave schedule. Perhaps it is that outbuilding over on the left. We're not sure. Or could have been a barn where those enslaved people lived together. But we can see that they were just about to be, at that point in 1859, broken up in some interesting ways. The 1855 tax assessment for unincorporated Washington County, which many of you, of course, have worked with, lists the names and valuations for tax purposes of enslaved people on the Charles Richard Belt of Chevy Chase Manor estate. The fascinating thing is that when we jump forward 7 years to the 1862 Compensated Emancipation Petition by Charles Richard Belt, and I think most of you know in the district through Act of Congress, all the enslaved people who were resident in the district on April 16th, 1862, what we here in the district term Emancipation Day, were manumitted. Their owners, their white owners, or usually white owners, occasionally black owners, received a certain degree of compensation, assuming they filled out the proper paperwork and could attest to loyalty to the Union, that they weren't pro-Confederate. And the very first name you see, Lethe Bowie, is the mother of almost everybody here, with the exception of Henry, who is her brother, her older brother. And that's the same name, Lethe Bowie, that we see in 1817. But if you look very carefully, you'll notice that there is a discrepancy between those names in 1855 and 1862. And we were sort of wondering what happened to three of those names, Charlotte, Anne, and Clarissa. They were there in 1855, but they're not here being manumitted in 1862. Well, the answer to that is found elsewhere in the Compensated Emancipation Petitions, which are an extraordinary resource. Lisa and her team use them extensively to reconstruct the lives of people, of enslaved and free people in Georgetown. And here, for example, if we look at William Edis, who was a prominent grain merchant in Georgetown, who was going to get a monopoly, more or less, during the Civil War on grain shipments to the U.S. Army. He is manumitting, in other words, putting in a claim to be compensated for freeing the woman, the enslaved woman, Charlotte Gustus. And he explains, in fact, that he had purchased her from Charles Richard Belt just a couple years earlier, and gives particulars about her. Similarly, just around the corner, Morris Adler, who's a clerk in the War Office, who has property roughly where the Georgetown Safeway is now, just close by Dumbarton Oaks, had purchased and now is freeing Anne Bowie, precisely the same woman who had been 7 years earlier up in Chevy Chase. And similarly, his Morris Adler's son-in-law, William H. Dougal, a prominent Georgetown artist and engraver whose work is well beloved to this day, had purchased Clarissa Bowie, whose name we'd also seen in 1855. So that's quite interesting. Other evidence indicates how they're related. Hannah, whose name we had seen way back in 1817, had a daughter, Charlotte, and a daughter, Alethea. Charlotte is the person who sold October 19th, 1858, down to William Edis in Georgetown. And then soon after that, we see Morris Adler buying Aletha's first daughter, Anne Bowie, and then William Dougal purchasing Clarissa. This is wildly speculative, but Lisa and I have wondered, because we're very interested in as horrific as the slavery system unquestionably was, it did not entirely eclipse African-American agency. And we do wonder, perhaps, if Charlotte, having been sold down to Georgetown, entered into certain conversations encouraging her, as it were, the neighbors, to purchase her niece and her two nieces. As tough as enslavement was in Georgetown, it may have been preferable to the conditions on the Charles Richard Belt plantation, way out in unincorporated Washington County, where they may have been in a much more vulnerable position. So there may have been some efforts, this is speculative and we're looking for more evidence, to bring her nieces safely into Georgetown. In any case, we do see that Clarissa very quickly sets up a household and stays there a long time, and is very involved in life around local church communities. When she dies in 1908, she is actually, she's buried in Mount Zion. She may have been a member of the Female Union Band Society. She's married to Richard Cantor, and they have a family that's well established in Georgetown by the late 1860s. Meanwhile, Lethea's brother George, who was also enslaved by Charles Belt, we see from about 1855 on, is married to also up in Chevy Chase to Carolyn Bowie, who was enslaved by Notley Moreland. So that in 1862, you can see on the left here, this is in the newspaper, Charles Belt is claiming compensation for these individuals, including George, while Notley Moreland is claiming compensation for Carolyn Bowie and for her children, who have different, some of them have different last names because of other fathers. But by in 1860, here's the slave schedule. We can see that Notley Moreland has a number of enslaved people who match up in terms of age and gender. The names aren't given, of course, in the slave schedule. And one of those is clearly Carolyn, and then we see her children. So by 1862, we get the names: Carolyn, she's 24 years old, Jack and Annie, and then Mary Bowie. By that time, it's clear she had given birth to at least two children with her husband, who sorry, we'll go back here, with her husband George. All right, so George marries Carolyn. We're not sure who the father of these mulatto children are. Perhaps Carolyn was impregnated against her will by Notley Moreland or a member of Moreland's white family. But in any case, this whole family makes their way down to Georgetown post-emancipation. And Carolyn continues to live as his with her children. By 1898, she's still a cook at 3021 P Street in Georgetown, and she too is buried at Mount Zion when she passes in 1899. So Mount Zion, we get a sense of the way that it is a kind of welcoming for people who have been through really horrific experiences of families being separated and so forth, to find a degree of safety and mutual support. I'll briefly mention the enormously interesting connections to Dry Meadows Farm. We just talked about James Fisher, of course, 8th generation descendant of George Poynter. And James was always very interested in the connections between the free people in the Poynter Harris farms and the enslaved people. He had a theory that perhaps Thomas Harris may even have come off of the Belt plantation. We're not sure about that. But we do know in any case that Thomas and Mary Ann Plummer's son, John Harris, who served in the 1st Regiment in DC of the United States Colored Troops, spent time, people went back and forth between Georgetown and Dry Meadows Farm, and their daughter, Ella Harris, is unquestionably buried in Mount Zion. There may be many other Harrises, at least I know, has been trying to figure out all these other Harrises, and if they are in fact part of the same group of Harrises. It seems likely, but we're not absolutely sure. And then finally, I'll just mention another really remarkable family that I've come to know. I attended Sidwell Friends School, and so was always fascinated by the enslaved people who lived on the property of the Sidwell Friends Upper School and Middle School campus when it was the Highlands, owned by the family of Joseph Nourse and his descendants. And that includes William Brooks and Sarah Brooks. William Brooks seems to have been purchased by Joseph Nourse, along with his, who was at that point the registrar of the Treasury, along with his siblings and Anne Brooks. He marries Sarah Brooks, who seems to have been the daughter of Alec Oliver and Rachel Oliver, who were quite fascinating history, owned by Dennis and Ariana Lyles up in Tenleytown. The house is well known to many of you. And so Sarah herself is buried. She had been a cook at the Highlands. She'd been very prominent in both at St. Albans during the slavery era and then in the Independent Methodist Church downtown. And she's also buried in Mount Zion when she passes in May of 1875. And her grandfather, interestingly enough, Frank Brooks, also resided at the Broadbrand settlement adjacent to the Harris family. Seems to have rented land for well over a decade with his family. And it was quite beautiful as his descendants were corresponding and chatting recently with Jocelyn Julian, who's, of course, a well-known descendant of residents of this family, of this area, that her, I believe, grandmother recalled Frank's daughter quite well. So they're fascinating connections that tie together, as we say, the cemetery. We could go on and on, but this is just to give us a little glimpse of the fascinating connections between the African-American communities in freedom and enslavement of Chevy Chase and Mount Zion and the Female Union Band. The cemetery, which are really sacred places in so many ways, and deep repositories of extraordinary history of the entire region, but do have these fascinating and very moving connections to the story of slavery and freedom struggles in Chevy Chase. I'll just mention one interesting thing about Sarah Brooks that Lisa and I really are fascinated by. We have noticed, as we've worked through the records, a number of cases of enslaved, people who are listed as being free in 1860 as free people of color, nonetheless show up in the compensated emancipation records, which suggests that they were in sort of an ambiguous state. In other words, they were free enough to be listed in the 1860 census as free, but enslaved enough that their owners were seeking compensation. But here's a particularly interesting case where Sarah Brooks's husband is seeking compensation for his wife and children, who he had evidently purchased but hadn't actually gotten around to manumitting. So now he's trying to get money. And in a version of this, I'm not sure we can quite see it here, but you'll see that Sarah Brooks had also signed her name and then it was crossed out. I think the couple probably realized they could get more money for her if they insisted she was also enslaved, and therefore her husband was entitled to more compensation. So it's a fascinating little glimpse as this family is preparing. As soon as they get off of the Highlands, off of the Sidwell Friends territory, they make their way up into Fort Reno and establish an independent household, and eventually some of the family makes their way to the what's now Broad Branch, before eventually getting down to Virginia and Baltimore and so forth. So it's just a fascinating little window into the kinds of strategic decisions that people are making on the cusp of legal enslavement and legal freedom. And back to Lisa on what's happening now at the cemetery.
Well, there are a couple exciting things happening, and one is that we're looking at repatriating folks, and one of them comes from this story that the Washington Post had a series in August around what was going on with the human remains that the Smithsonian is still storing, and they started putting human stories to the human remains. And we found out two of the people who have had their brains removed and their families not notified are buried in our cemetery. One is a 21-month-old baby, and the other is a 47-year-old man. And so, and not only are we looking at that, I saw Ruth Tricoli is on this presentation or listening, but we're also looking at repatriating, hopefully, some of the people that we have found, or we haven't found, but they have found in Georgetown on Q Street. I'm sure some of you have heard that story. And some of the things that we're excited about that we're working on now, and this is just a minimal list because today I just got off the phone with another exciting project, but I won't mention that yet. But what we are working on, stormwater management, like a lot of historic Black cemeteries, we are being flooded by waters that are being directed into the cemetery. And I'm sure this has happened more, over 100 years. We have a sewer cap in front of the cemetery, but it doesn't intake water. So all the water comes in the cemetery and has eroded and most of the, a lot of the cemetery. So DC is finally committed to 1.6 million in fixing the problem, and ground should be breaking in just a couple weeks. We're also, with that 1.6 million, we're looking to also get what is the historic Line Mill Road, which is actually the road between Oak Hill and the Female Union Band Society. Oak Hill has a fence that separates them from the street. So when you look at it, it looks like it's just an additional part of our land. And so it's where people come up and down. It literally is connected to Rock Creek Park, but it's a hot mess because the city took us off the maps. I don't know, maybe for the last 60, 80 years. And they also took their own street off the map. So they haven't taken care of that. And so that looks a mess. But people constantly come up and down it. Somebody's going to hurt themselves. But hopefully they are now going to turn it into a working trail. And maybe we'll also be able to get some funding where we'll be able to tell the story about Indigenous people and African Americans in Georgetown on that trail. Fingers crossed. And then we're also researching and assisting our friends in Georgetown research some of the people who were formerly enslaved, who may be buried in the cemetery. Ironically, it wasn't until last year, or 2022 rather, that we actually found our first connection next door to the Dumbarton House. We had some really awesome staffers who decided to take time and go outside of the interpretation period of Dumbarton House, which was awesome because there was a whole family that lived there for like 100 years. And, that's not their interpretation period. But finding out that we have people that are buried in the cemetery that were enslaved there for 70 years. And so that's exciting. And then after that, now we have other historic sites coming to us asking for help. I'll mention Tudor Place because they have an exhibit, and I was on the advisory committee, and the exhibit is called, I can't think of it, Ancestral Spaces, that focuses on the free and enslaved people that worked at Tudor Place. And again, we have connections to that. There are people that are buried in the cemetery that were enslaved there, like Barbara Cole, and who is Hannah Cole's mother. And so very excited about that. And then lastly, I'll just say, please follow us on social media. We could be found at Black Georgetown, and then also our website. I was just typing, somebody asked about how you could find out about those who were buried in the cemetery. We have a cemetery information database that we're constantly updating, and that's blackgeorgetown.info. And so you could put someone's name and see, and so there's opportunities to volunteer, and we're, entering information. Patrick Tisdale, who's my amazing partner in crime, working on the cemetery, who's a volunteer, That just sounds like he's way more than that. But he helped establish this database, and it's going to do amazing things. We're really trying to connect the dots with the ancestors and put pieces together. They didn't just have to be in the cemetery. We would put people together with relatives, all of those things. So we want it to be really robust and rich, and hope to share it with other cemeteries around the country for free after we get all the bugs out. So I want to say thank you for this opportunity.
Thanks.
And
We're just
so I went to questions.
right. We're going to move to, but I think so. We're going to look at the. I think we can look at some questions and some Q&A.
Yeah, Mark, this is Chas Cadwell. I've been collecting
Okay.
questions and
Okay.
got some of my own. We don't have a huge number in the chat, so but you talked a few times about a slave schedule. What is that? Is that a government document or like a black census?
Uh, right. So every 10 years, of course, there is a federal census, and it gives, during the antebellum period, gives increasing amounts of detail. There's a unified census through 1840, but then starting in 1850 and 1860, there's a separate what's called slave schedule that lists the names of slave owners and tells us the hardly ever does it actually give names of enslaved people, but it does list the ages, the sex, the male or female, and whether or not people are black or mulatto. And so that information is extremely helpful. So when we speak of the slave schedules, that's usually 1850 and 1860 that we're doing to at least know the number and the age and the gender of enslaved people. And what we usually do, we spend a lot of time doing this, is putting that together with probate records or other legal records. That is to say, when enslavers die, there's usually a court-ordered inventory of their estates, and you can sort of match those up. And usually then you'll see the names, the ages, the valuations of enslaved people, though not always. Also, there's slave petitions that we work on. So one needs to triangulate a lot. And the slave schedules are just really the point of departure for beginning to trace the extremely complex family histories in Black Georgetown and the rest of the district.
And so by 1870, did the census go back to its pre-slave schedule format?
In a sense, yes. So sometimes the 1870 census is the first census in American history that lists everybody. And for many years, genealogists who worked in African American history talked about an 1870 brick wall. It was sort of thought to be very hard to go back beyond. We've been learning, and thanks to many really wonderful Black genealogists, all sorts of research techniques that let us go far before 1870.
Yeah. Lisa, you said that someone wrote a question about the size of the Mount Zion and cemetery compared to the 22-acre Oak Hill. And I don't know if it disappeared once you answered it in writing, but can you, for the rest of us?
Oh, yeah. So we're together, both sides be 3 acres, and they're about roughly the same size. They were larger. It was about 3.5 acres. And then the federal government, National Park Service, wanted to establish a horse trail in 1930. And so instead of taking a little bit from the 22-acre cemetery, they were like, oh, no, 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 no. We will not touch the great founders cemetery. So they took a 1/2 acre from us, and they in 1930, and have no records of where they put the markers or the burials or anything. And so yeah, that's a problem. And we went all the way down to Rock Creek, our cemeteries, the property. So
given that small size, were there other Black cemeteries in Georgetown at some point?
yes, there were. We were the first, but there was one where actually Ruth probably is better at this, where the Q Street burials were that keep coming up. There was indeed a cemetery there. Not sure what it was called. And then there is another one. There's only 4 historic Black cemeteries left in DC. We are 2 of them. And then there's another one in Georgetown. It's about an acre, which is closed all year round except for one day, Memorial Day, and that's Union Burial of Georgetown. And then there is Woodlawn, which is actually as large as Oak Hill, 22 acres, located in Southeast Washington, DC.
Lisa, I see there was a question from Gail Sonneman about the where the actual papers of Mount Zion United Methodist Church are located. They're with the church.
They're with the church, and I was telling that we have digitized some of the records, but there is nothing. It's not open. They're not open to the public as of yet.
At your own location, Lisa, are you open every day, or are there tours scheduled? How can people see the cemetery?
So we're just open. There is no gates. We are not a dog park, so please don't bring your dog, even though people bring their dogs. We will be putting signs out, no dogs. So we're open. You know, we're literally attached to Rock Creek Park. So, you know, as long as it's daytime, it's pretty good. And I totally welcome you to go there because you can walk into the vaults. It's a very, you know, peaceful, beautiful place. So please come.
But are there in fact scheduled tours though, if people want to have a guided experience?
So they're self-guided tours. And yes, if you follow us on social media, every once in a while, we'll go ahead. It's a little, you know, winter time, you know, the weather is spicy. And so, but I do try to do one on President's Day. I just have not confirmed yet because we have a lot of connections to presidents. And so we try to like highlight the people buried in the cemetery that have connections to presidents, being related to presidents, working for presidents, so forth.
I also see there's a question about Belt Road, which, yes, is one of the many roads that trace this long history of the Belt family. But I should mention that it is widely believed that there were enslaved people, not only obviously white enslavers, but also enslaved people buried in that general vicinity at the intersection of Chevy Chase Parkway and Oliver Streets. And that's worth thinking about, how we honor those ancestors, and are there appropriate markings and ceremonies and work of respectful memory that is called for, even though we don't know the precise sites of interment.
And of course, there's the connection as well with the Moses Road Cemetery in Bethesda, now under the bowling alley parking lot.
Mark, there's a question for you in there about Black. It says, Mark, do we know how the free Black land ownership at Dry Meadows and neighbors on Broad Branch came about?
Kate, are you there? Can Kate pop in? Or Jocelyn can also speak to that. But it's a fascinating history. There's a wonderful book on the topic, which everybody should look at. But George Pointer, I mean, very, very briefly, as he purchases his own freedom, seems to acquire from time being enslaved and working on the C&O Canal, then is the key figure. There's a fascinating history of the rest of other members of his family securing that land. And although there are other families involved, and it's a really heartbreaking and tragic story, which HCCDC has been working with others on restorative justice. That really dreadful process through which this land that was owned so long by proud free people of color was alienated from them by the district in cahoots with other, real estate interests and so forth. So that by 1931, I believe that's the last African-American family land ownership on the land that basically becomes Lafayette Elementary School, where my sister and I actually, went to school with no idea of the long history of injustice.
Kate Atkinson, I opened your microphone if you have anything to add.
Thank you, Ches. And no, I think you did a great job, Mark, describing what happened at Broad Branch and how the community, in concert with the District of Columbia government, made sure that these Black folks who lived there a lot longer than Chevy Chase community had been in existence were forced to leave. So thank you for informing us of that.
Kate, what do we know? We've seen different accounts of where the earlier Belt Manor House may have been. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because while there's clear evidence from tax records and so forth in the early 19th century, but there's this long period of most of the 18th century that's a bit of a mystery. Do you have any sense of where the earlier Belt Manor House may have been?
No, it is a mystery. Kim Williams, an architecture historian for the district, who's probably on this call, has extensively researched it to try to figure out where this manor house was. The one on Oliver Street doesn't really match the architectural style of the 1700s. It fits more in the, well, of course, that house is gone right now completely, but it fits more in with the late 1800s. The thinking is that manor house might have been further north. There was a Belt family home on the property where Chevy Chase Country Club now sits. There was a major fire there in, I believe, about 1910 that destroyed that house. Remains of it are still standing, but it has been almost completely rebuilt. But I believe Kim Williams might be able to tell us more, but for right now, there's just no definite understanding.
I just did want to get back to the very important point that the final African-American family to stay on the land that becomes what we now think of as Lafayette Elementary School and Lafayette Pointer Park were the Shorters. Richard and Rosa Shorter, who are the ancestors of Jocelyn Julian, who I think is on the call, they held out the longest. I think, Kate, that's right, that they held out the longest, resisted pressures of eminent domain, tax arrears pressure, and so forth. But even they had to leave, though they don't go all that far away. But it's just heartbreaking thinking of that long history of Black land loss. And I think there must be something like 8 or 9 schools, public schools in the district that are similarly founded on the theft of Black-owned land. So it's if we're talking about restorative justice, there's a lot of work to be done around that.
Mark, was the book that you were referring to, was that the one Between Freedom and Equality?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, wonderful book. Yeah.
Somebody asked about that. I thought that's.
Yes.
That's Barbara Boyle Torrey and Clara Merrick's Green. Yeah, and well worth reading.
Georgetown University Press.
Yeah.
There's a question about whether we have a YouTube channel. We do, but we post all the videos of all these events on our webpage as well. Because the YouTube channel is cluttered with ads and other garbage.
Right. There was also an interesting question, and I don't know the answer. If there are in Chevy Chase any structures still remaining that appear to have been constructed by enslaved labor, the Belt Manor House almost certainly would have, at least parts of it would have been constructed by enslaved people, but that of course has been taken down. Kate, do you have any ideas if there's anything? Any physical traces of the labor of enslaved people still on the Chevy Chase landscape?
Well, the great mystery is the old Jones farmhouse on Casada Street. That's been recently renovated, although the developer who has renovated and added on a large extension in the back has preserved some very old house foundation and the south side structure of it all the way up to the rafters of the roof. And that house could be as old as the 1780s or 90s, although there's no, we have not been able to prove that. It could be anywhere from the 1780s to the 1830s, looking at the hand-hewn logs and the way that they were identified, the way they were cut and identified at the site. So that could have been built by slave labor, but it's speculation at this point. Don't have any smoking gun.
Great. If there are any last questions, we are running out of our time. And I want to give a chance for Carl Lankowski to wrap up. If you've got other questions, you can always email them to us at hccdc@comcast.net, or and when we close, I'll put the websites for both Historic Chevy Chase and the Mount Zion Female Union Burial Society on a screen, so you can check out both those web pages. And if you're really enjoyed this presentation, you can contribute to both organizations. But before I make more of an ad, let me ask Carl Lankowski to rejoin us.
Well, thank you for an engrossing discussion of the networks connecting Block, Chevy Chase, and Georgetown. And thanks to everyone attending tonight and engaging with Lisa and Mark. Your participation helps steer us toward that outward-looking, inclusive, and diverse community to which we aspire. A link to the recording of tonight's conversation will be available on the HCCDC website in a day or two. And wanted to say that a wide-ranging, deep, as tonight's conversation has been, we hope it's whetted your appetite for further insight. So let me suggest, in closing, that you visit the websites of HCCDC and Black Georgetown Foundation and follow Mark's blog posts. Web links will be on the closing slide for those. We also appreciate your material support so that we can contribute to organize events like this one. So I invite you to consider becoming a member and/or making a decision on donation. Good night, and hope to see you soon.